welcome everyone officially to the Sci-Fi film series. I'd like to just introduce Dr. Vincent Piturro, Professor of Film Studies at MSU. Take it away.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is very, very fun. It's a great film to talk about for so many different reasons, and we'll get into all of those reasons, over the course of the next hour or so. I'm joined by Chun, a space scientist from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. This is a show that we actually rescheduled. So first thing I have to do is apologize to you for rescheduling. We happened to schedule this on the night of the All-Star game last month, and I was offered tickets to the game. And if I didn't take my son, I would probably be disowned as a dad. So we decided to go to the game, and we postponed, but that gave you, another few weeks to watch the film, and that's okay because it's a fairly long film with a really interesting long history just about the film itself, the actual film itself. And we'll get into all of that. First, just a couple of notes. This is our 11th year of this sci-fi series. We started this in 2010, and so last year's series obviously was very short and online. This year has been online as well. But the good news is we have a live in-person show coming up on September 30th at the museum. We will be screening and discussing Arrival by Denis Villeneuve. Chun and I co-wrote a chapter in the book that was just mentioned. Could we put that flyer up perhaps with the book and the flyer for the 30th, the September 30th show, if you can. But yeah, there we go. So on September 30th at the museum, we will be there. Chun and I will be there to discuss the film. My colleague, Dr. Andrew Pantos, a linguist who wrote a piece of the chapter as well, will be on hand, and he'll be talking about the linguistics in the film. We'll all be signing books at 6 o'clock, and then at 7 o'clock, we'll start the film and discussion. Now, the book should be out any day. They keep telling me any day. So you can pre-order it on the website, the McFarland Books website, or you can buy some books. You can buy some books or buy a book the day of the screening on the 30th. All author proceeds for the book are being donated to the Food Bank of the Rockies. So the authors, we're not going to make any money on it all. We probably wouldn't have made any money on it anyway. But if we do, we're donating that to the Food Bank of the Rockies. And also on September 30th, that night at the museum, we'll have students from the film club at MSU Denver will be on hand to collect non-perishables for the MSU Denver Food Bank. We have a lot of students. I think it's over 40% of our students experience some form of food insecurity. And so we have a pretty good food bank at MSU Denver. So show up, grab a book, get the book signed, join us for the film and discussion, and also donate to a great cause for MSU Denver. The book is great. I think it came out really great. As I said before, Chun and I co-wrote 3 chapters: Arrival, 2001, and Interstellar. And there are also 7 other chapters co-written with other scientists from the museum. President and former Dr. Nicole Garno, Steve Lee, Jeff Stevenson, Naomi Paquette, and who am I missing? Joe Sertich on Jurassic Park. So fun book. And if you like the series, you're going to love the book, right? Because it's sort of a book version of the movie. This is the movie version that we're doing. And, the book's always better than the movie, right? I don't know, maybe not so much in this case. But anyway, that's about the book and the show on the 30th. You're going to hear more about that. You can follow me on Twitter if you'd like, and I post those events on there. So that's all that. So now let's get to the show and the film, Metropolis. Chun and I will be talking a little bit at first, and then we're going to take your questions. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat room starting now, if you'd like, and we'll get to them. We'll collate those, and then we'll get to those in a little bit. You may have a bunch of questions about this wonderful silent film from 1927, directed by one of the greats of all time, Fritz Lang. We have to do a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of sci-fi history too, to talk about this, because sci-fi and cinema were really connected from the very, very early days of cinema itself. The most famous early film was Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, based on Jules Verne. And um, and that was in that was 1902, just a few years after the invention of the art form. Fast forward a little bit to the 1920s. The 1920s silent film was very much concerned with dystopias, utopias, the machine age, fascist societies. Now, if you think about it, the 1920s was a very, very dynamic time in the world, right? There was this sort of fight between capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, all going on all around the world. And, a lot of that was very much centered in Germany. And you know the story of Hitler and what happened there. But that was sort of going on in many places around the world. Even here in the United States, there was a debate between communism and capitalism. Women had gotten the right to vote just before the 20s in the US and in Germany. And then we had the Roaring 20s, where women had this newfound independence and liberation. We'll talk about that and how that plays into the film in a little bit. But that's sort of the mix, the milieu of what was going on in the 1920s. And that's why the focus was on those dystopias. Is capitalism leading us to a dystopia? Will there be this great divide between the rich and the poor? And that's one of the themes in Metropolis. If you've seen it, that's quite obvious. But that's been really a common theme in science fiction right up until today. And it kind of started with Metropolis. So Metropolis gave us the themes and the aesthetic of science fiction cinema that really it kind of still takes hold today. Is still relevant today. We have the futuristic cities, the factories, the cars, the flying planes, machines. Chun's going to talk about that in a little bit. We have a class warfare, fascism. You have a mad scientist lab, where he uses electricity technology to create the robot. Of course, that, a lot of that comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That's always a staple of sci-fi. You have the telescreens for spying on people. You have the dystopic machine age gone bad. And of course, you have the objectification of females in a very patriarchal society. And again, that relates to the society of the period of the 20s. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, just to the history of the actual film a little bit is quite interesting as well. In 1927, it ran well over 3 hours. Premiered in Berlin, huge premiere. It had a symphony, played an original score. Everybody thought the film was too long, except Fritz Lang, of course. Every director in history never thought their film was too long. But after the premiere, the film was cut. And so the original was only screened really once, at one time in Berlin. And ever since then, it's sort of like the holy grail of cinema. Everybody's been trying to recut the film, put it back together, get it back to its roots. And that really took kind of hold in the 70s into the 80s. There's a really interesting 80s version by Giorgio Moroder, who recut the film, made it an hour and a half, and set it to a pop music, rock music score. If you've never seen that, it's really quite fascinating. We'll play a clip of that in a couple of minutes. So there have been different versions of the film, throughout history since 1927. What happened not too long ago, I forget exactly how long ago, about 10 years ago, workers in a museum in Argentina found a 16 millimeter print of the film that was a very close version to the original version. So Kino took that version of it, recut it along with the original notes and original screenplay and original reviews of the film from when it first came out. They recut the film into this complete version that we now have today. So we have this missing footage that we've never seen in there before. We also have even sections of it where we still don't have the actual film. And in this complete version, we just get screen titles about the action, what's happening to kind of make sense of the entire narrative. So we still really don't have the complete film, but the latest version from Kino is about as close as it gets. And the Film Society, that's the version they have. And if you've seen it through the Film Society, that's the version that that's the latest version and the most complete version. So the whole thing, has this really fascinating history. There's a whole sort of side story about films that were lost and found, and films found in our closet in an old hospital, those kinds of things throughout history. That's a fascinating subject on its own. I will say this about the film, though. I see the film as kind of two different films. The one film is a story, which is, somewhat banal, really. It's kind of trite, and not super, engaging. It's just the story itself. And then there's the aesthetic of the film, and that's the beauty and the wonder of this film, and that's what's held up throughout time since 1927, and that's what's been copied so many times throughout history. And Chun's going to show some pictures, and we'll look at the main building, Joe Frederson's building. We've seen that throughout history many, many times. And if you know anything about that, you can put it in the chat, unless you're my students. That's kind of cheating because we went over that in class. But if you've seen this building before, once we show it later, just go ahead and put it in the chat and let us know where you've seen it. So I really love the aesthetic of this film. And as I talked about before, that aesthetic really set the tone for science fiction cinema, has been copied throughout history. And it really kind of elevated science fiction to an intellectual level. If you know about film in the early days, film was sort of for the masses, for the lower classes, for the poor. People looked down on film. They thought it was just a sort of ugly art form, for people who can only afford 5 cents and go to the movies, et cetera, et cetera. German expressionism in the early 1920s, and particularly a film like this, Metropolis, elevated cinema to a higher level, to an intellectual level. And this one elevated science fiction specifically to that next level. And the war would stop sort of things for a while, but then that would really kind of kick in later in the 1950s. So this film is interesting on so many levels. It's so important on so many levels, has so many wonderful parts to it. It's been copied so many times, and we're going to talk about all those things tonight. Now let me introduce my friend and colleague, Chun, who we worked together for 11 years now. We've probably presented, 30 at least films together over the years, and co-wrote 4 of the chapters in the book. So Chun, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Vincent, for introducing me, and as well as the film. And I actually have a short presentation that I've put together about my thoughts on Metropolis. And so I'll just start that right now. But as Vincent said, Metropolis is one of the earliest and one of the most prominent and important films about involving science fiction. And I think it's also a really interesting film because of the way that it tries to depict the future. And Vincent has already talked a bit about the themes. And I think, for those of you who watch it, the themes kind of leap out at you. And I suspect there have been thousands of books and articles and essays and papers and undergraduate theses that have been written about the theme of the struggle between the workers and the capitalists. And there's also really interesting religious and Christian iconography and themes going on in the film. But as far as the science goes in the film, there's far less to talk about. And that's just because the science that we see is really mad scientist science. And so
Chun, I just wanted to jump in, say you're a little bit quiet. Is
this slightly better?
That's much better, thank you.
Okay, yeah, it might be my mic not being right there, but so the film science is more about the mad scientist laboratory. And so you see beakers full of liquids and electric arcs and, strangely enough, bubbles. And so this was obviously an inspiration for Frankenstein and generations of mad scientists who came after this movie. And obviously, this is not how we make robots today. And so I don't think it's a good way to talk about the science in the film. But I think what the film really does a good job of is thinking about the future. And so that's what I'm going to focus on, is the futuristic aspects of the film. And part of the problem with talking about the future is that the future is difficult, is really hard to get right. And so you can see where a lot of Long's influences are coming from. He's showing depiction of the future, photo of skyscrapers and elevated walkways and roadways and trains. You have commuter aircraft flying around in between the buildings. And you also have the newfangled neon lights, and that were beginning to appear in cities like New York and Chicago at the time. And so this was kind of a spectacular, really fabulous looking depiction of a future city. And then finally, of course, there's also the depiction, an iconic depiction of a robot android, its creation by the mad scientist character, and kind of this plot point of the robot threatening other human characters, which has become pretty cliched, and was perhaps cliched even back then, but it has become pretty iconic. So let's talk more specifically about Metropolis's future. And I think it's kind of interesting to see that the way that the filmmakers created the future was a mix of the future as seen by the filmmakers of the time, of the late or mid 1920s, and their present as well as their past. And like I said before, it's very difficult for artists, for filmmakers, for storytellers to try and depict a future. And everyone who tries always does a really terrible job. And that's just because, for anyone who attempts this job, they have only the present to go on. And so it's really difficult when you're living in that present to understand what technological or social trends become important that evolve in a way that leads you to some futuristic scenario. And so in Metropolis, there are definitely some very futuristic elements, like the robot, and the robot is now a very standard trope, standard idea in science fiction. But at the time, it was relatively new, and people even complain that Long was plagiarizing the idea of a robot from Carl Čapek's play RUR, which was the first depiction of a robot. And it even introduced the term robot to our media landscape, and that came out in 1920. And so people were complaining that Long wasn't giving Čapek his due. But the Maria robot later inspired future robots such as C-3PO. You can see that in Ralph McQuarrie's early artwork for it. And then you can also see how that eventually evolved into C-3PO as we know him. But other futuristic ideas like skyscrapers, those were a few decades old, but this was a projection of what skyscrapers are like in their present, and then pushing it to the future to include planes, trains, and automobiles, or at least slightly futuristic iterations of them as far as how to get people moving around. And you also see scenes of elevated pedestrian walkways as well. And then we also had this idea of this stratified city, so that you had different layers to society, and you had this sense that the upper crust lived at the very top, and the lower your social status, the lower you also lived in the city. And then, of course, obviously, these cityscapes inspired the look of futuristic cities from artists like Mobius to films like The Fifth Element and Akira and Blade Runner and so forth. And I think someone mentioned this in the chat already, but this was perhaps the first instance of a video phone that appeared in film history. So predating the video phone in 2001 by many decades. And it's really kind of fun to see the main industrialist operate this. He's tuning dials. It seems like he's fixing the frequency and to try and connect with the main worker in charge of the machine down below. And the other aspect of it that I really like, yeah, and this doesn't necessarily involve technology, but there's just beautiful production design, although a lot of it just shows up for just a few seconds. So if you blink, you'll miss it. And especially for some of the ground level cityscapes. And so you see design elements that's influenced by Bauhaus and by other art movements. And there's also, really dramatic looking architecture that's really unique. Now, in addition to the more futuristic elements or the more pedestrian or more present day elements, at least the present day of the 1920s, so elevators weren't new. They were patented in the 1850s, and elevators started showing up in skyscrapers in the 1870s and 1880s. But I like the idea in this film of how the workers riding these large communal freight elevators, whereas the upper society get to ride in more smaller personal elevators. And then of course he had planes as a mode of travel. And but I mean, there were complaints at the time that this wasn't futuristic enough. So H.G. Wells wrote a scathing review of the film in the New York Times, and it's fun to read. You can find it online. But he complained about how the technology of air travel wasn't very futuristic. Why weren't there helicopters being shown? And if you look at the cars, they're all 1920s vintage vehicles. Apparently, the filmmakers didn't really want to go to the trouble of making futuristic cars. And the filmmakers also looked to the past. So if you look at the mad scientist wrote Wang's house, that's very Gothic looking. That could appear in a 19th century or a movie taking place in the 19th century about vampires or werewolves. It looks really out of place in this futuristic landscape, and the interiors are also nicely Baroque, and kind of scary looking, like this staircase, and then this dungeon-like scene where they're about to enter the catacombs. And then, of course, when Wang captures the human Maria, that's in a very dungeon-like kind of environment. Now, the last part that I want to talk about in Metropolis is its depiction of how the city works. And I think that's really interesting, and it gets you thinking about how workable or realistic this might be. And in a way, it probably isn't very realistic, but it's still really fun to think about. So at the very beginning of the film, right after the opening title, you see this montage of pistons and gears and machinery and things moving and being powered. And this is all giving you a sense that the machinery runs the city. And of course, this is all very cutting edge for the time of the 1920s. And if you look at some of the media that was developed to promote the movie, they talk about how the city was divided into 3 levels. So you had the upper class, the industrialists, the intellectuals living above ground, and then below that were the power systems that kept the city functioning. And finally, down below that were the workers' homes. So there was an underground city where the vast majority of the population presumably lived in. And the workers were the ones running those power rooms. And we see that early in the film where they did these sort of inscrutable tasks. You didn't really quite understand what they were doing, except it was a lot of steam was involved. So obviously everything was steam powered, but it was also crucial for workers to keep the tubes and the pipes or the hydraulics or the steam machinery under the maximum pressure, because if they didn't, then everything would go haywire and you'd have catastrophe happening and people dying, people getting scalded. And so obviously this machinery was all finely tuned, and you need to have personal attention to make sure that it all ran correctly.
And then, of course, at the end of the film, the worst case scenario occurs when the heart machine becomes unattended and everything goes haywire. And all the electrical components go nuts. And not only does the energy components collapse and break down, but apparently those components were also keeping underground reservoirs of water at bay. And so the water floods the city, the underground cities, destroying the workers' homes. And then, of course, there's also an above ground impact so that the electricity goes out above ground. So looking at all this, we might say, wow, this is pretty preposterous because we're seeing civilization depicted where the workers are working themselves to death with repetitive motions, trying to keep society functioning. And you also have this kind of crazy idea of these giant reservoirs of water that are just sitting there waiting to inundate the underground cities unless the power keeps them at bay. And finally, you also have this power system that's so fragile that if you leave it alone for just a few minutes, the system goes bonkers and destroys everything around it. So, of course, this all seems really silly, but then you read headlines and you learn about how there are workers today in our society who get injured because of repetitive work that they do for long hours in order to keep our society functioning smoothly, or at least to keep deliveries delivered. And then there are also dams at risk all over the world at risk of collapse. And part of that risk comes from extreme weather due to the greenhouse gases that we emit into the atmosphere. But then there's also infrastructure support where we lack the funding to help shore them up. And then finally, just recently, earlier this year, we have an example of a power grid that became disabled and came perilously close to completely collapsing. And a lot of people suffered because of that. So I think, despite the fact that the film is almost 100 years old, it's well over 90 years old, and it doesn't really predict the future, Metropolis, even if you focus on just the technological elements, do have some relevance to us today. And there is a saying among historians, or at least you hear it talked about history, where history doesn't really repeat, but it can often rhyme. And so I think, perhaps we can come up with a similar metaphor for science fiction, that good science fiction can never exactly predict the future, but it can definitely rhyme with reality. So with that, I think we're ready to open it up to questions.
Yeah, I saw a couple of questions about the show we're doing on the 30th, if it's going to be hybrid, and if we're going to webcast it. At present, we don't have any plans to do that, but maybe it's something we could talk about. So stay tuned for that. The museum will be sending out messages about the show as we get closer. So definitely something we can talk about.
I believe the event goes live tomorrow. So if you check the website tomorrow, it should be all going. Okay. Yeah, we had a question about the music. And I know it's been set to different music, but someone recognized themes reminiscent of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which I was, of course, just listening to. So
yeah, so the music is really a sort of fascinating story with this film in many ways. There's an original symphony written for the film at its premiere in 1927. Gottfried Uppertz wrote the original symphony. It was only done live once at that premiere. Luckily, we have the music. We have the sheet music from it. So for the latest version, the restored version, the Kino Lorber version, it was recorded finally for the first time and set to the entire film. That was the original score. As far as Shostakovich, I'm not sure that was a specific influence. I've never read or heard anything about that. I know Uppertz was influenced by Wagner, of course. And then he tried to add some modern touches as well to kind of play off of the machine age, that sort of stuff. but there have been so many different scores over the years, so many different versions of the film, so many interesting ones. And I brought a clip of one of those. It's from 1984. Giorgio Moroder actually bought the rights to the film, recut it himself into an hour and a half, and set it to pop music, rock music. And the first time I saw it, oh, actually, it was also colorized as well. So the first time I saw it, I was, aghast. The film historian in me just blew up. I hated it. It was an abomination. It was horrible. But as I got older, maybe I softened up a little bit, and I go back to it now, and I kind of like it. I kind of think it's interesting. It's a different take on it. If you watch the film, the edit of it actually, does the film justice. And I think the music does the film justice as well. So can we play that clip now? We're just going to look at a little clip from the beginning of the film. It's the workers going to work, and we can hear it with the music as well. By the way, this part looks a lot like Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times from 1936. Exactly right. He basically copied this beginning. And the whole underline. You can get it there. So that's just a little taste of what that version is like. I know you're all fascinated by it now, and you're going to want to run and check it out. Good turn. Maybe that'd be fun to kind of do that at the museum sometime. Play that version of it. I think it'd sound really great through the IMAX speakers. Even though it's not an IMAX film, it would be the IMAX experience. But that might be fun. So that's a little bit about the music and the history of it. Really interesting history. We can go on, just for another hour, just about the music and all the different versions of it. And you mentioned Mobius. He did a version of it too. That's quite interesting. So that's what I have about the music.
Very cool. Somebody noticed the luminescence of the characters' eyes, especially Maria's. Are those special effects?
Yeah, well, early special effects. I mean, of course, you have everything's linear editing at this point. There wasn't any green screens or anything. So that's all done through lighting, and specific lighting that focuses on the eyes. They could also do some of that in post-production as well, where they could darken the negative around it to make the eyes jump out a little bit more. But yeah, early special effects, but those are mostly done in camera, some done in post-production, but most of that's done, you're right there in camera.
Which is especially remarkable when you think about the sequence where they're transforming the robot into a human-like android, and there are multiple layers of special effects that are happening. But as you said, Vincent, I mean, everything seems to point to in-camera effects, and so the cameramen and the filmmakers work really hard to create visuals that were never seen before. And I believe they also really kept a tight lid on how exactly it was done. You know, they viewed them as trade secrets. And so even though they were written up at the time, there is some confusion about exactly how some of the stuff was done.
Yeah, and a lot of it just looks to me like double exposure, triple exposure kind of stuff. So you run the film, you run the camera, you film the robot on stage, and then you can do the effects in several different ways. Lighting, you could draw them right on the film itself, the film stock itself, and then you just lay that on top of the original shot, and then you could layer other effects on top of the original shot as well. That's what I mean by in camera. That stuff is just double exposure, triple exposure, sometimes 4 or 5 layers of exposures there, so you can get the effects and get them all in the right spot. You think about the special effects in the films, overwhelming. I am always just, it boggles my mind. The editing in the film boggles my mind. When you think about a film that was 3 hours long, but was probably, you probably have 20, 30 hours of film, and editors doing this by hand. They're cutting and taping the film together by hand at this point. And I mean, the film took over 14 months to make, had a cast of hundreds, maybe thousands at points. The entire German cinema industry was basically working on this film and trying to get this film out. It's a monumental, epic film, and the special effects are mind-boggling. The editing is mind-boggling as well, and the sets, as you mentioned, they're mind-boggling as well.
And I believe the other kind of amazing thing about just the filmmaking process was that Lang often had multiple cameras running simultaneously for shots. And so when people have found footage from the film, oftentimes, I mean, I guess I don't know enough to know what percentage of these shots were, but sometimes they'll find alternate takes of or slightly different takes for a particular scene, but other times it'll be the same take, but from a completely different camera angle. So there appears to be, I mean, lots of variations that we don't quite understand because so many earlier versions of the film have been lost.
Yeah, and one of those, I think one of the things you're talking about is there's that one scene where it's sort of very angular, and the workers look like they're sort of walking into each other and over each other. And what Long would do was he was filming the workers walking one direction, had another camera shooting through a mirror. And so he took those 2 takes and then spliced them together to get shots like that. So a lot of stuff was innovative, but there was also stuff that had been going on for many years in cinema. I mean, this is 27 now. And the 20s for me was the golden age of cinema, where just before sound came in and filmmakers had really figured it out. It's wonderful, beautiful cinema. There's so many great films from the 20s. And 1927 was really the end of the silent era. But Long had learned from everything that came before him, going back to George Méliès, G.W. Griffith in the early 1900s, started doing rehearsals, multiple takes, using different lighting. So that stuff had been going on for a while, and he learned from all that, kind of put it all together. So what you see in this film really is a compendium of film history from 1895 to 1927.
So, special effects again. How did they do the glowing rings around the robot?
Chun, do you want to try that, or I can
Actually,
not a trade secret?
yeah, you better take it because I don't feel confident about my answer to that.
Yeah. So that's just, again, double exposure, triple exposure, and they did some lighting tricks as well as they were exposing it, so they could kind of layer over the rings over the. You take a shot of the robot, and then you do these rings. It might be just one ring in one place, and then another ring in another place, and another ring in another place. So it's essentially like stop motion, and then you layer that on top of the original shot of the robot. So you get the sense of motion and the electrical rings. So it's a combination of several different things. We don't know exactly, again, how those things were produced, but we sort of reverse engineered those things, considering the technology they had in 1927, which was fairly good, but obviously it wasn't CGI. It wasn't green screens or anything like that.
So this film you mentioned, very influential, and we saw the link from the robot to C-3PO. What are some other influences that we can see from Metropolis forward?
Well, so a lot of the city aesthetic, we see that in Blade Runner. Blade Runner's, the sort of the big one. The building, the central building in the film that Chun showed a picture of before, that building shows up in several different iterations throughout history. It's copied, exactly an exact copy of it, which shows up in Blade Runner. It's the police station, and Deckard comes in and lands on the top of the building. That's an exact copy from Metropolis. I did notice too, the building shows up in an episode of the Clone Wars too. I've been watching a lot of Star Wars for Star Wars class this fall, and it showed up in an episode of Clone Wars. And there are a few others, I just can't think of them at the moment. But of course, the robot, throughout history, C-3PO, even The Day the Earth Stood Still is, somewhat based on that, and they, Robert Wise looked at that as well.
There's Rotvang's hand that he lost in an accident, that involved the making of the robot, and so there's a Dr. Strangelove reference to that. And then I do have a few more slides that I can show, and these aren't necessarily, may not be things that inspired by Metropolis, but I think at the time, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, you saw a lot of science fiction stories and a lot of ideas just being percolated about how big cities could grow vertically, as well as just the breadth of these cities, and then you see artwork like the story by Dan O'Bannon and Mobius for The Long Tomorrow, which was also highly influential because obviously Mobius was inspired by Metropolis, but I think other people were inspired by Mobius in the story. And then of course there are a lot of city skylines and cityscapes, from Akira to Blade Runner to The Fifth Element, that has some roots in Metropolis, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, we also see that in the Phantom Menace and the Star Wars prequel movies. We see the city, and they're flying through the city. I think there's one scene, Anakin and Obi-Wan chasing somebody who's trying to kill Padme, and they're flying through the city, that cityscape, and the way the flying cars are going in very specific lines. That comes directly from Metropolis. The whole dystopia, wasteful sort of society. We've seen that in so many different films. The makers of WALL-E actually looked at Metropolis and considered the whole like dystopia, and they took that to they extrapolated that out and what could happen there, where finally the Earth is just a pile of garbage. Gosh, I can't think of any more off the top of my head, but if any more come up, I will bring them up.
And for everyone, I'm putting a link in the chat where you can pre-order the book. Just as a reminder, September 30th will be live, and that will feature the film as well. You'll watch the movie and then get to talk to several scientists about it. And if you have any more questions, pop them into the chat. I was really impressed with the performance of the lead. I forgot her name, but she played the robot and Maria. And her, I'm going to call it over the top, but I think it was perfect for the silent film. Her evil persona was amazing. And
there's actually like 3 different Marias if you think about it, right? There's Maria the angel, there's the robot Maria, and then there's just the first Maria. But that the sequence where Rotwang and Joe Fredersen send Maria out into the club, and she's dancing, and she's driving the men crazy, and basically starts the riot. That starts to bring down the city. That's what I was talking about earlier when I was mentioning the whole idea of the Roaring '20s and women's liberation. And if you think about it, that you have this patriarchal society. The men are in control and they're scared. The men are in control, scared by women being liberated, scared that they would lose power. And, the loose woman running around the city, driving men crazy, starting fights, starting riots, starting civil wars, was a danger to society. That's one representation in the film that kind of fascinates me. And, we had to, the men said, we had to stop this. We have to put a stop to this. And that's, the representation, I think, that is most fascinating for me is that version of the Maria. The robot Maria is really cool, but I think as far as the time period is concerned, it's very relevant. Gosh, we haven't seen that in history since 1927, where the white men in society are worried about their place and losing it. Think about the late 40s, early 50s, when the men came back from war, and the women, Rosie the Riveter, the women had some independence, and the women were working outside the home, and they wanted to keep doing that. And the men, put a stop to that, right? Because women can't be working and they can't have independence. And that's what gave us film noir. That's really what film noir is all about. The femme fatale who is going to bring down society and is tempt the good men because they're liberated. Of course, we're looking at that right now, right? We're going through that in society now. The men are just worried about losing their place in society, and, look at what we have. So I think the Metropolis was inherently a political film. There's a lot of politics in there. It may have been watered down a bit, and pun certainly intended, because the city is flooded. But, it's a little confusing, though. People like to think of it as a leftist or a Marxist film, and this was the '20s when there was a fight with the Weimar Republic and the oncoming fascism of Hitler. What did Germany want? What did Germany need? Was it this leftist politics, or was it a sort of far right politics where the patriarchy takes control and runs the country? Well, we know how that turned out for Germany. And so I think it's a fascinating case study of the period. It's a fascinating comment of the period as far as politics go. And it's a fascinating role of the women in society at that time.
Yeah, and I think even if you look at what the theme of the movie is, I mean, you see the statement repeated both at the beginning and at the end of the film that the mediator between the mind and the muscle is the heart. And so that seems to suggest that the workers don't really have any intellect, and so they have to rely on the intellect of their superiors. And you still need the heart to mediate that, but that also means that you don't necessarily need to educate the workers so that they can make a choice in a democratic society. They can still be ruled over, but as long as you have this heart mediator, everything's okay. So so that's not necessarily a message that resonates well in a modern democracy. But I also really like Mitch, your comment about just how good the actress is, and I think the actress is Brigitte Helm, because when she plays the villain. I mean, when we were first introduced to her, her second appearance down in the chapel, that is a very Madonna-esque appearance, and even her name, Maria, that gives you a connection to the Virgin Mary. But later on, I mean, she basically becomes the Whore of Babylon from the imagery that we see at the nightclub, and throughout the latter half of the film. Whether it's probably a combination of her artistic choice as an actor and also the director, but she distorts her face so that her face is very asymmetric as far as her eyes. One eyelid is partially closed, and her body her arms, her hands, and her neck and her head are all very angular. So it just gives you this sense of something inhuman or something off about her. So I think they just do a really good job of just showing via visuals. Again, this is a silent film, so visuals are all important, but just showing how different this character is just by looking at her and how different she is from her other persona.
Yeah, amazing. Also, this is just my question. The dance that she does in the nightclub is very bizarre. Is it just my modern eye that it looks bizarre, or was it meant to be like weird?
Well, I'm sure it's meant to be weird, and I'm pretty sure it was weird in the 20s as well.
Cool.
Although I can't speak for going out to a club in the 20s. But if you think about it, it's sort of this take on the flapper society, though, right? And women running wild and loose, and I think it's just taking that to the extreme there.
Yeah. And we have a comment that some people found the ending to be disappointing, kind of a cop out, which is what you were saying. It ultimately affirms the structure of the society,
Yeah.
where everyone's back in their roles.
Yeah, nothing changes at the end. Nothing changes. They say, "Oh yeah, we're going to try to work together more." Now, if there was Metropolis 2, it would probably start out with Raderson saying, "All right, everybody, get back to work now." I'm sure that's how part 2 would start. So the ending, yeah, is really, really squishy. Cop out is one way to put it, for sure. Like what just happened. By the end of the film, I think Long was so enamored with the visuals, the aesthetic of it. I don't know if he even cared, about that part of it. And that's why I said at the beginning, this is 2 films for me. That whole storyline just is sort of banal, but by the end, nothing really happens. But it's the aesthetic, the themes, the underlying messages of the film, I think, that are really interesting, really important, and have been so so copied and so important in the history of sci-fi.
Actually, I think, Vincent, I mean, at the end, it's actually a much worse situation than nothing happens, because the worker city has basically been destroyed, right? So they're all homeless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the human Maria has managed to save most, if not all, the children. So they're, the movie has managed not to kill any young children on camera, which would have been really bad. But whereas the above ground surface dwellers, all they've lost is their power, and presumably, once they fix things, they'll have their power restored. Whereas the workers will probably be even more at the mercy of the above ground dwellers, just because they have no home. I mean, they're just bereft of really anything now. And then I do want to comment about the nightclub scenes, and that the shot behind you, Mitch, isn't from the nightclub scene, but it's from a parallel scene shortly after, where the robot Maria, the evil Maria, is talking to the workers and trying to convince them, and convincing them to riot and to rebel against the people up top. But I think the nightclub scene is definitely very surrealistic, because you have these multiple eyeballs that are on screen, and Anshan Andalou came out like a year or 2 after this, so surrealism was a big art movement, and a pretty big deal at the time. So this was kind of like an early precursor to that. So it's kind of fun to see these leering men, but then they focus on just the eyes, and have a mosaic of eyes. I mean, I think the only thing that would have made it worse, or better, depending on your perspective, was if they had focused on their leering lips and their tongues wagging. But I think it was pretty provocative as it was.
That montage reminds me of in Hitchcock's Spellbound, the dream sequence, which of course this came first, so I'm sure that was deliberate.
Well,
Someone
Hitchcock,
pointed out,
Hitchcock actually started making films in the silent era, and he trained in Germany with the Expressionists and worked with Long as well. So we see that in a couple of different Hitchcock films. Sabotage is one of them, and Hitchcock did kill a kid in Sabotage. They blew up a bus, and the kid was on the bus. Hitchcock would say later that he regretted it and thought it was terrible, but I don't buy it. Hitchcock was a mean, dirty SOB. So I'm pretty sure he was happy to kill the kid on screen because he couldn't do it in real life.
all right. Somebody pointed out that they were maybe trying to portray a futuristic form of dance, which is like you were saying, Kachun, visions of the future are often things in the present taken to an extreme. So it was swing dance pushed to its edge. And then,
But in Weimar, Republic Germany, all sorts of things were being tested, boundaries being pushed. So I suspect that what they depicted in this film wasn't too far off from what you could find in various clubs in Berlin.
interesting. Now, Dr. Piturro, I'm just going to read this question because I don't quite understand it. But can you comment on the frame rate? There's a 16 FPS version on YouTube that looks more natural, but runs almost 4 hours. Was that closer to the original viewing?
No, that the original viewing was probably somewhere along 18 frames per second, something like that. FPS is frames per second. So the deal with film in the silent era was most of the time in the early cinema it was hand cranked. So you didn't really have a specific frame rate, somewhere in the 14 to 20 range. But most silent film was 16 frames per second, or I'm sorry, 18 frames per second was about the standard. Now the time when Metropolis was made, they had motorized cameras. So they would have a specific frame rate, probably 18 frames per second. The reason that always seems weird to us is because when sound came in just a couple of years later, to sync the sound with the image, they had to run it at 24 frames per second. So sound film is 24 frames per second because it comes closest to reality, and it has to sync up with sound. So that's where we get the 24 frames per second. Silent film, probably closer to 18 frames per second. 16, maybe a little bit tighter. I don't know exactly, but I'm guessing the original was probably 18 frames per second, and that's why it ran over a little over 3 hours. 16 would probably make it, longer.
Interesting. And if you run it slower, your film lasts longer. Save some money on film, right?
Yeah, but it looks, strange.
So somebody's asking, what influence did the Nazi politics have on the film? And we noticed several religious symbols. There was the crosses when we first saw Maria. There's a Star of David on some of the doors in the Mad Scientist lab. There's a pentagram behind the robot's chair. So,
well, I mean, there's a lot of religious imagery, symbolism. Early on, the Good Maria is sort of preaching in a very Christ-like way. The pentagram is in there. So honestly, I just don't know what the entire point of all that was. Maybe there was some sense of a Christ-like figure would come and liberate them, and the Maria at the end is kind of that figure. But it's all kind of mushy and doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So I don't have a specific idea about all that. I will say though that we're talking about 1927, and the fascist era is like this close. Many of Germany's directors and movie stars would leave Germany soon after the beginning of Hitler's the party anyway took power. So it's really sort of on the cusp of this society that maybe there was some was a religious society earlier in the World War I, 20s society, but is moving kind of away from that into a more the debate was between capitalism and communism. The Weimar Republic was very much capitalism, but communist influences were coming in, and that's sort of when Hitler came in the middle of that and took power a few years later. So it's really an interesting time period. There's a lot of different influences going on. There's nothing really sort of clear going on in the society at that time. There's a lot of disparate factions. So maybe some of that squishiness about the film, represents the society of the time.
Yeah, and the inverted pentagram, the star. I mean, and it's not a Star of David, as someone points out in the chat, I think, because that's 6 points. But that appears prominently in Wolfgang's house, because you see it behind him in his lab when he's working with Maria. So I think there's some mystical element that's associated with this mad scientist character, and the fact that he lives in this very Baroque, Gothic like environment, so that it doesn't really speak to the future or modernism. It really harkens back to the past, and that perhaps, and going back to this Frankenstein theme, that even though he's a man of science, perhaps, but he's also messing with powers and messing with technologies and forces that perhaps man is not meant to deal with. But I also find, like you said, Vincent, some of the Christian symbolism somewhat squishy, because there's definitely a lot of Christian symbolism and Christian themes, from the Tower of Babel to the idea of the Book of Revelations, and this horror Babylon showing up in the nightclub scenes. But if you think about how the movie ends, it's not Christian redemption that saves the characters at the end. It's that the fact that they managed to capture the robot and are burning her at the stake, and the robot is revealed as the evil character that it is. And so I mean, it doesn't seem like, perhaps I'm missing it, and there is something subtle Christian about the ending, but it does seem like another sort of cop-out where they introduce all these Christian themes and iconography, but in the end it doesn't really resolve itself.
Yeah, absolutely agreed there. It almost seems like they long got to the end of the film was like, what am I saying? I'm not really sure. So let's just finish it off and, whatever. The workers aren't saved at the end. There's no, like saved from the the dictatorship, the authoritarian system of this world. So it's hard to kind of put your finger on that. I thought this film for over 20 years, and I sort of gave up on that. I just took a Long's approach. Yeah, this is here, this is there, this is great, but look at the aesthetic of this film. That's the beauty of it.
So we're just about at time. So just a couple more questions. You mentioned that this is the first science fiction film, and you didn't say that. Somebody thought they heard you say that it was the first science fiction film. What is the first science fiction film?
Well, there's I talked about it before. I believe I said, and we're recorded, so we can go back and check.
Yeah.
But I said, yes, science fiction and cinema were tied from the beginning. Georges Méliès's 1902 Trip to the Moon, was really the first science fiction film, and one of the more famous ones, of course, throughout history. What I said about this film was this is the first great science fiction film. This was the film that put everything together that we had seen for over films about 30 years old at this point. So everything we had seen up to this point, it puts it all together. It puts the themes together, the aesthetic together, and that's what would be copied so much throughout history after it.
Nice. And then Chun, mad scientist labs tend to have a similar aesthetic. Where does this aesthetic come from? Why is it always Jacob's ladders and bubbling beaker Erlenmeyer flasks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm an astronomer, so I've never really worked in a lab like that. But one of the reasons why Mary Shelley in her novel Frankenstein, used lightning as the device to bring the monster to life was that it was relatively recently that of galvanic response was discovered. Meaning, if you take a dead animal like a frog, and if you had electrodes attached to a battery and you connected the electrodes to the animal, you could actually cause that frog's leg to twitch. And so there was this, and people didn't completely understand, nerves and electrical conductance or really any electromagnetic theory at the time, but there was a sense that electricity meant life. And so that's why she used this electricity metaphor for Frankenstein's monster. And so I think that has persisted since then. And once you started making science fiction films, whether it's Metropolis or the original Universal Frankenstein, the filmmakers, the set designers, the production designers, they sort of gravitated towards using electricity as a depiction of that. And if you think about it, by the 1930s, electricity was sort of old hat, but at the turn of the century, electricity was still relatively new to a vast majority of the population. Many people didn't have electric lights or anything that ran on electricity, so you could still, and perhaps, there were still a lot of people who didn't have electrified homes, perhaps the vast majority in the United States, since the population was still very rural. So I think, using electricity to designate the mad scientist, that was just something really easy to do. And then scientists at the time, they worked a lot with beakers, and they were mixing chemicals. Chemistry was still a novel science where you were making lots of new fundamental discoveries. So I think a lot of that imagery just comes about what people thought was novel and interesting at the time.
Yeah,
Also strike.
I'll give it, and thanks, Chun. I'll give it a really simple answer to that question. The mad scientist lab, the mad scientist aesthetic, all that came from this film, from Metropolis. Everybody afterwards would copy it, and Frankenstein, the Universal version, is a good example.
Yeah.
It also strikes me that like the mystical symbols in the scientist lab, it's kind of like bubbling cauldrons you might see in a wizard or witch's lair. So we're about the end of our time. So final thoughts, recommendations for the next film people should watch until September 30th when it's arrival, and you should join us at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and with your book, and you can get it signed.
Yay, in person.
I'll give my final thought. I think it's been close to 30 years since I've first watched, and perhaps the only other time that I've watched Metropolis. So I probably watched a version that was, perhaps 90 minutes or maybe slightly longer. So I was a lot younger, obviously, back then, and probably not as sophisticated in my understanding of film. So I don't think I had a very memorable experience, but rewatching it, especially this longer version, it's definitely a really engaging film, and I think a lot of the themes were definitely much more evident to me, and just being allowed to think about the film and to reflect on it, and coming up with the presentation that you saw about the technology and about the ideas of the future in the film. I think it's a really interesting case of revisiting movies that you might have seen a long time ago, and coming up with new interpretations.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that and say I would, maybe we could do that Giorgio Moroder version at some point. I think that would be kind of fun to do because it keeps the spirit of the original, but it's 90 minutes, I think, and it kind of boils it down. So the themes, I think, are a little bit clearer in that version. Moroder focuses on that class warfare idea, the idea of this working class and then a ruling class with nothing in between. And that is the kind of essential binary opposition of science fiction from Metropolis. It started with Metropolis, and we still see that today. Think of like a film like Alien, for example. You don't think about it too much, but in Alien, there's the working class and there's the ruling class, and it happens right there on the ship, right? You have the guys who are working, down in the dark tunnels and fixing everything and leaks and all that, and then you have the corporation who sent them out. That is basically the ruling class, and they're bickering about shares and making money and all that sort of stuff. So we've seen that happen throughout that binary opposition throughout the history of science fiction cinema. It's always been a controlling theme. And that's what I think about this film. I think two things: that controlling opposition, and then all I think about are the images, the aesthetic of everything, the city, the workers, the above ground, all of those things. If you look at different versions of it, see if you find those things and see if the story changes at all in those different versions and those shorter versions. But it's a brilliant film. It's a wonderful aesthetic, and it's been immensely influential throughout the course of history.
Yeah, really. I watched it for the first time and was blown away. It's a really amazing aesthetic. And for our final question, I do believe this will be on the DMNS YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure. So if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with your friends, please do. And otherwise, please join us September 30th in person at the IMAX Theater for our next sci-fi film series. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.
Night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Goodbye.